Right, so I'm just going to give a few unedited thoughts on the BBC pay scandal. So for people that don't live in the UK, I'm going to have to explain something that we call the license fee. So the license fee might seem a little odd, but essentially we have to pay a license in order to watch live television. The license fee is the license fee subsidises the state programming, which is the BBC, so that's the British Broadcasting Company. But it also includes other channels as well, which are partially subsidised by the license fee. Now, the curiosity of the license fee is that you can't get around it by only subscribing to non-state channels. So you can't just say, well, I'm going to have a subscription to Sky News, for example, and I'm going to watch maybe just the free non-state broadcasting channels and therefore avoid paying the license fee. No, that you can't do that. That would be illegal, which is sort of a weird idiosyncrasy of the UK. That even if you don't want to watch these channels that are subsidised, you still have to pay the license fee if you want to watch any live television, and it extends to quite ridiculous levels where my understanding is that even watching a YouTube live stream, if you don't have a TV license, would be illegal, although I don't think anyone would ever be prosecuted for doing that. But I mean, even watching foreign television, so even if you were to watch something like CNN in the UK without a license fee, that would still be illegal, which is totally bizarre. And again, I don't think anyone would be prosecuted for watching CNN, but the weird thing is that technically you'd still be required to have a license fee. And this also extends now. Recently, this was only sort of live television, and people found creative ways to avoid it by sort of watching live television with a lag on it or something. And I think that would constitute not watching live television. But another thing that they've done is now watching on demand for certain content is also illegal without a license fee. So that includes the BBC iPlayer, which is on-demand BBC television. But most on-demand stuff does not require the payment of the license fee. But yeah, it's sort of one of the oddities of Britain. I mean, there are other weird things about the license fee. For example, if you're a student and you're, say, away from home, you also require a license fee unless you have a laptop. And I'm not making this up. Unless you have a laptop that doesn't have batteries in it, and then you're allowed to watch live television on that laptop, provided that you don't put batteries in it. Again, I promise I'm not making this up. This is perfectly true. So there are really weird laws concerning the license fee, and it's criminal as well. It's not just a civil law, so you can be prosecuted. I'm not sure if anyone's actually had jail time for non-payment of the license fee, but it is a criminal offence, and you can be fined quite a large amount for not paying it if you want to watch live television, and you can't really get around it by. I mean, if you buy a television, you're expected to pay the license fee. So, if the television is even capable of receiving live television, even if you've disabled it in some way so that it doesn't, you still have to pay the fee. So, anyway, that's a brief introduction to these absurdity of the license fee. So the BBC pay scandal is essentially people in the BBC, which again is this state-funded channel. The salaries of some of the most highly paid BBC presenters have just been released, and to the tune of some of them receiving as much as 1.5 million or more than that every year, which is, we're talking seven-figure salaries, pounds, euros, dollars, whatever, seven-figure salaries. So quite large amounts really for someone to be earning every year. And of course, since the license fee, it's effectively a tax. I mean, it's I suppose it's not you don't technically have to pay it, but if you want to watch any kind of live television, you do. So it's effectively a tax. So these people are public sector workers, and the controversy is that they have to they have these exorbitantly large salaries that is being effectively paid for by the taxpayer. So and people would argue that a sports presenter, for example, isn't going to be worth a six-figure salary, and I suppose I can understand that. Now, firstly, it's not quite as simple as it sounds, because you have to take into account the fact that there's the market forces are still at play here. It's not like, for example, the pay of MPs, for example, which are quite a lot lower than a seven-figure salary. But it's not like that, because the presenters, the anchors on the BBC, could be bought off by the private sector. So the BBC still has to compete with these private companies. So it is to be expected that the salaries are going to be inflated compared to an institution that doesn't have private competition. So that's not unexpected. But I think the controversy is just how large some of these salaries are, to the point where it is really unnecessary and excessive. In many cases, the salaries are so high that they're not competitive market prices anyway. So they can't even be justified as being market competitive. And also, of course, the problem is, I mean, we'd expect public services have to we have to be economic with the funds. So it wouldn't matter so much if these salaries were in the private sector, because obviously we tax people and in the private sector, and that sort of forms part of the government revenue. Whereas if you're in the public sector, you receive. I mean, obviously you're still taxed, but you're a recipient of that public revenue. So you'd expect these public institutions to be more economic with the way that they use their funds, and less concerned about big names and brands, because of course now I'm not saying that talent doesn't play a role. I mean, clearly it does to some degree, that if you pay more, you get better talent for these roles, these actors, these anchors, and so forth. But it's more, I would say, about name recognition. So it's more about big names, sort of brands almost, that people are paying for to present the news or whatever. So I think it's clear to argue that it would be better for us to have someone with less experience, maybe as a news anchor, someone perhaps younger, who we can afford to pay a salary that's maybe a tenth of what we pay the bigger names, and then the bigger names can presumably find a deal in the private sector. So this is the main issue, that we should not be so concerned with having these big names, because I don't think it's justifiable to have these such huge salaries. Now, again, there are exceptions. That there are clearly outstanding reporters, anchors, presenters within the BBC, but I wouldn't say that is universal. I would say that there are people that have big name recognition but don't have unique talent, and that other people with lack of name recognition could be employed by the BBC. And this sort of, I think the advantage of this as well, to employ some sort of younger, less experienced people, is that they get the experience, and then they can, I suppose that they can go on and work in the private sector if they want. So I don't think there's necessarily a bad thing with having people with slightly less experience that can be paid a lot less, because they don't have the big name recognition. But again, I'm not saying that there aren't people within the BBC who aren't outstanding in terms of the talent that they offer. But I would argue that there's not necessarily a good correlation between the most talented people within the BBC and the people that are paid the most. I'd say it's more about the brand, the big name recognition. So I mean, you can kind of see it, that the people who are presenting on things like Top Gear and sort of sports, they're the sort of very commercial type sectors that they're getting paid the most, because there's a lot more in the private sector. There's a lot more money in this, so there's greater competition there. So you can kind of understand it. but I think we have to if we have to live within our means, as the Conservatives would say, and since this is public funds, I think we can definitely reduce the costs by employing younger, less experienced people, and we wouldn't, and the loss that we would have in terms of talent would not be unassailable, because it's mostly about the big name recognition. Okay, so the other argument is that the BBC is actually already economical with their funds, because the license fee has actually got cheaper, and we've had more services. And I think that's true. And I also I will confess that I did behave in a reactionary way on Twitter to this, but I do think the BBC is a good service. I mean, the BBC is it's high quality. The news that's provided, I mean, obviously you can't please everyone, but I would say that the news that the BBC news is relatively impartial. And more importantly, there's no there's no advertising. There's some element of self-advertising, but there's no real advertising on the BBC, and that's the main reason. That's what most of the license fee goes towards. I mean, you don't have to pay for the adverts. So obviously, it's a public service that we all benefit from, and like I say, I mean, it's got cheaper over the years, and it's not that expensive. I mean, it's certainly not a prohibitive cost, and a license fee for all its issues is probably superior to a tax, because I mean, you could the distinction about whether the license fee is voluntary or not. I can understand that you can't really buy a TV without getting a license fee, but it's still better than a tax that doesn't give you any choice at all. So the BBC does provide a service, and it does it pretty economically as well. But of course, we can't see the counterfactual. We can't see the counterfactual in which we sacrifice some amount of this big name recognition for being able to provide much lower salaries. And I think there's a very good case for saying that if we had done that, then we would be able to get the license fee for even less, and with with not really any sacrifice in terms of content. So my overall opinion on this is that that should be done in some respect. We should give more chance to the sort of smaller names. We should sort of focus more on meritocracy rather than name recognition. Again, I don't really care what goes on in the private sector. That's just market forces at work there. If people want to have high salaries in the private sector, that's actually a good thing, because it means more revenue in taxes anyway. So I don't have an issue with salaries in the private sector, but in the public sector, I think we need to have a good hard look at this and say, well, let's employ people on a meritocratic basis, and that will involve paying really quite high salaries to get very talented people into the public sector. But it will also involve paying quite talented but less experienced members that don't have the name recognition. Okay, so that's where my thoughts are. And now there was, of course, another thing. This is, of course, 2017, so there's the obligatory outrage regarding the gender pay gap and so forth. To be honest, I mean, firstly, you can't really compare like with like in this. I mean, people are saying that the average man in the BBC earns more than the average woman. Right, but you can't compare the same job. They're all doing different jobs. Some people are doing multiple programs. Some people are doing, for example, football, which is, again, obviously you're going to be paid more if you're a football commentator, because again, you're competing with the private sector, and it's a lot of people watch football. You see what I mean? So there's no real way to compare like with like. So this whole gender pay gap, I mean, again, you can't really control for these extraneous variables. So there may be something in it, but again, if this was purely if there was no interaction between the public and the private sector, like in the Houses of Parliament, it would be easy to do in a comparison. But there is an interaction, because these anchors have to be competitive. So it's not quite as simple as that. So obviously I think it's just hysterical outrage, to be honest, because we don't know if this really isn't due to institutionalized sexism. I mean, if it was, then that's illegal, and it's been illegal for the last couple of decades. And you can't pay someone for the same work, and then because they're a woman, pay them less. You can't do that. So again, if that was actually happening, then there would be a justifiable lawsuit, and I would definitely encourage that. And if people do think they're being underpaid because of something like gender or race, then they should try to make a case for that. But I'm not convinced it's not just an artifact of different jobs and so forth. And and the fact is that negotiation here is going to be particularly important. So since there's this private sector competition potentially going on, if I don't know, ITV offers you a lucrative contract, and you could say, well, if you don't pay me more, I'm going to go and work at ITV. And then they would say, okay. And we know that there's been studies on this that said that sort of men tend to be more aggressive with regards to negotiation than women do. So maybe there's something in that. But again, I honestly don't know. But I think people are jumping to conclusions here, and with this claim that there's institutionalized sexism, when there doesn't seem to be much evidence for it beyond sort of saying that men on average in the BBC are paid more than women. But we don't know why that is. We don't know whether that's institutional sexism or some other factor at play here. So I think conclusions are being drawn without evidence. But nevertheless, despite all this, I think there is a problem. Regarding reforming or abolishing the licence fee. Now, I have behaved in a reactionary way before, and I do regret this to some degree. I don't think the licence fee should be abolished. Like I say, it's far preferable to having a tax. Just despite these weird idiosyncrasies that happen with it, I think some of those need to be ironed out. And again, there is value added there. I think maybe in some sense it can be reformed. Maybe by making it optional. Although I suppose if you make the licence fee optional, there's more scope for it being abused. Again, if you want to argue, if the licence fee won't pay for itself, if people don't want to pay for the content, then that's an argument for, well, we shouldn't be subsidising it if people don't value the content. So I don't think that's the issue. I think people do value the content, but I think a bigger issue is that if you to set up a service where you can not access, there's only a few channels that you can't access. I think it's going to be quite easy for people to abuse that and then access them anyway. I mean, you could argue that there's already a lot of abuse of the license fee anyway, and people. I mean, it's not that easy to track someone down for abusing it, particularly in these more idiosyncratic ways, watching live streams or whatever. But I don't know. I think maybe some reforming of the license fee may be appropriate. Try and make it more voluntary. I mean, it is already to some degree voluntary, but try and give more of an element of choice there. Okay, so that's about it. If you're not from the UK watching, you might have enjoyed the rather bizarre nature of the TV license that you have to have in the UK, but that's one of the more unusual things about living in the UK, and I'm sure you'll find it every bit as bizarre as I do.